Thank you for joining us for our first ever City Club program via Zoom. My name is Maureen McCarthy, and I am the president of City Club. Our mission is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. At our June 24th meeting, also via Zoom, we will be joined by Clyde Ford. In addition to being a past presenter for City Club, Mr. Ford has also worked as a psychotherapist, a software engineer, an instructor at Western, and he's a sought-after speaker and the author of several books. His latest book is now available, and it's called Think Black. His program will be called Technology and Social Justice During a Pandemic. We hope you can join us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank BTV Bellingham. They will be taking the recording of today's meeting and making it available for their viewers. I'd also like to thank the volunteer members of our program committee and several members of our board. They have worked very hard to take what is usually an in-person meeting and turn it into this Zoom meeting. We can't exactly give them a round of applause, but I absolutely want to acknowledge their hard work. We also want to acknowledge that we hope today goes without a hitch, and that could happen. It could also be that we have a hiccup or two, and should that happen, we thank you for your patience while we get things sorted out. Now, I would like to introduce Dean Wright, who will introduce our speakers and moderate today's program.
Thanks, Maureen. We can't be physically together today, but through the magic of technology, we are able to share what I think will be a very exciting program. We also won't be able to share lunch today. For that, you're on your own. Just a few words about the structure of the program. In just a bit, I will introduce our speakers. Then they will present their program, which will include slides you will be able to see on your screen. Now, a vital part of City Club programs is the question and answer session for our members, and we'll be able to do that today. As you're watching the presentation, if you have a question, look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little bar down there, and in the middle of the bar, you'll see a little chat button. So when you have a question, click on that chat button, a box will appear. You can type your question in the box and be sure to hit enter or return. Then our team of chat watchers will be monitoring these questions, and at the end of the speaker's presentation, I'll present as many questions as I can to them. Now, let's get to today's program. No country is more in the news these days than China, whether it's coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic or the ongoing trade war with the United States. I would also say that no country is more misunderstood than China. China is often caricatured as a backward, closed place. In fact, it's a highly complex, modern society. It has developed an infrastructure over the past decade that's become the envy of much of the world. A high-speed train network that rivals that of Western Europe. And as a frequent visitor to China over the past 15 years, I can tell you that China has also made some strides in protecting its environment. The air in Beijing is light years improved over what it was when I first visited Beijing in 2005 because of widespread use of electric vehicles and other measures that China has taken. Which brings us to today's program. David and Allison Roberts are longtime City Club members. They own Kulshan Services, an environmental consulting firm providing strategic support and public engagement to communities, businesses, and nonprofits. Most of their work has focused on protecting water and land, restoring salmon runs, addressing climate change, and promoting sustainability. Their most recent effort was to facilitate and support the City of Bellingham's Climate Action Task Force. Last fall, they were invited to participate in a unique cultural exchange to China. And they will share their perspectives from that journey today and some thoughts about what the United States might be able to learn from China. So please join me in welcoming David and Allison Roberts.
Hello, everybody.
Hi there.
Hi, Allison and I are thrilled to be here today for this first virtual meeting of City Club. We know you'd rather be there having lunch together, but given the circumstances, this is what we hope will be what we can do in the interim time period. As Dean said, we were involved in a very interesting trip to China in September of this last year. We were there for 17 days, hosted by government officials and universities in several locations. And what we would like to do today is share with you some of what we learned on that trip and hope that it provides you some insights that you might not otherwise hear from the media. We'll couch this by saying while we have spent some time there and had done considerable studying, since we are not specifically specialists or any learned person, but we did learn some amazing things that we think will be useful and helpful for you to have a perspective about China.
So our talk today will focus on three things and some details in between. China in context of its societal norms, and also in terms of history and a bit of data. Secondly, we'll provide just insights about what we learned while we were there and the people that we talked to that provided those. And then the third thing will be thoughts for the US and what we might learn from how China goes about business and the length of their cultural history that we might have something to learn from as well.
So our journey began with a coincidence of meeting Kevin Clark, who's a resident here of Bellingham. He had attended one of my climate talks in Bellingham, and after some conversations following that, thought that there might be some interesting opportunities for his organization who's working in China. He also wanted to introduce Allison and I to Zhihe Wang and Meijun Fan. They are both professors from Beijing and are currently doing study, research, and collaboration at Claremont College in California. Specifically, they work through the Institute of Postmodern China and the Institute for Ecological Civilization. Kevin is also associated with that group, and after a breakfast meeting and conversations about some of the community building and public engagement work and environmental education work we've been doing, he thought that we might be a great candidate for the next annual trip that the two professors were arranging for China. But before we do that, I want to provide a little context about what is a new concept that the Chinese are implementing right now. In the early 2000s, China's scientists looked at the way their economic development was occurring and the damages that were resulting from that, and were able to point out to the government that this would result in an unsustainable future. Around this time, the concept of ecological civilization was developed in China, and that basically focuses on a couple of main concepts. One is that humans and the natural world are all connected and that nature ultimately has its limits. And from that, they were able to say, look, there's a price to pay for this progress. This approach to looking at the interconnectedness of things, it incorporates traditions found in Confucian Taoism and Buddhist thought. And ultimately, this concept is more than sustainability. Interestingly, and that we had no idea about this, but the Communist Party adopted Ecological Civilization as a party platform in 2012. And in 2013, the Chinese constitution was modified to incorporate this as a goal. Since then, the question has been how to implement this and how to get people on board with the idea. So our trip was in part to look at this concept and how people are implementing it. The leader of this group was Dr. John Cobb, and he has been engaged with Zhehe and Mei in discussions of how to bring this ecological civilization concept to reality. John's work has primarily been in something that's called process philosophy, which is based on the work of a little-known person named Alfred North Whitehead, a philosopher and mathematician from the early 20th century. He promoted the radical idea that the world is an interrelated web of processes where societal changes have consequences for all systems. John Cobb has looked at that in a little more broad modern view and said that really when we look at the world, it's basically communities within communities within communities, from ecosystems through humans and all parts of the natural world. Zhehe became fascinated with Dr. Cobb's understanding of the world and thought that that might have some interest in China, and that then built a program for exchange between the Chinese government and universities and the Claremont College crew.
So our travels included Dr. John Cobb as well as 9 others from the United States and 1 Hungarian who came along on our conference. And part of those people continued on to South Korea for a lengthier stay than we did. Our trip ended up being 17 days, as David said. We had 4 destinations: Beijing, Liandu, Lishui Province, Pu'er, and Hong Kong. We spoke at 2 conferences that were hosted by 2 local universities, and we felt absolutely amazed by the amount of preparation they did for our sort of Rhodes Scholar trip. We had 12 or more different site visits to farms and businesses orchestrated by folks in each of these local communities, except Hong Kong, where we were on our own. And we had 9 different speaking opportunities where we got to engage with everyday Chinese people, local elected officials, and university administrators and professors. Plus, just talking with common everyday people and our interpreters, which were provided to us during the entire trip. So here's a bit of context. Like I said, we were accompanied by Dr. John Cobb and 9 others. You can see this very official looking edifice here in front of the university in Liandu. And I think there were some 300 people in attendance at this conference. And we were able to hear several different talks at that conference and the second one that we did. But what was really amazing to us was that we were there during a pretty momentous time. It was on the eve of the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. We were in Tiananmen Square just a week before the big military parade and all of the other kinds of pomp and circumstance to celebrate this event. We were there amidst months of protests happening in Hong Kong and the power struggle between the two, and just 4 months ahead of this pandemic. So it was a magical time. We enjoyed it very much. And I would have to say that we really didn't know a lot about China before we went, perhaps like most Americans. And we also saw that what our mainstream media tells us about China may not be the full story, that really it's important to talk with people and to learn more about them, and we can't always get that from our media.
I just point out this is Dr. Cobb right here in the middle, and he was 95 years old on this big journey through China and Korea.
So as I said, this was an opportunity to share perspectives, and what I spoke about was my work with Wild Wacom as a board member, and our work to get children outdoors and to teach stewardship and leadership skills using nature as our learning lab. And this was something that we found Chinese people to be very hungry for, because the emphasis in their educational system is on achievement and studying and testing. There's no time for anything else. Hobbies go by the wayside, and time in nature is not emphasized. You'll see in the bottom picture there, John Cobb was talking with various officials during the entire time. He was kind of like our professor emeritus, but also our leader of the entire group. And on the right was a picture of us at an eco-village that we visited in Beijing, which I'll talk about a little bit later.
And my speaking was about the building of multiple benefit outcomes for communities, something that was a new concept to most people there.
So yeah, building connections was, I guess, one of the highlights of the trip. We were assigned interpreters who we had many nice conversations with, and they provided a lot of context for life in China. It was very important to give us that personal connection. We became very fond of them. So now, as I said, I would provide a little historic context. And first of all, we just have to say in a caveat here that China's culture is one of the world's 4 ancient civilizations, and recorded history goes back 5,000 years, or no, 3,500 years of written history, but it goes back even farther than that. And they've been through many civilizations already, including 20 dynasties, and that doesn't even include modern China. So the length of time that they perceive history is far greater than what we have. In addition, they've never been colonized, so that has not left a legacy that we have seen in other countries that have experienced that. Now, societal context, we were amazed at every turn of things that were different or similar to what we knew about China. Of course, we know 1.4 billion people, 56 different ethnic minorities, of which 92 are Han Chinese. They still have 425 million farmers, which is more than the population of the United States by far. The Communist Party is really 6% of the population, and their population growth rate as a result of their one-child policy is really low, about 0.559%, which puts it quite 159th in the world. The other thing that we noticed was that China occupies about the same land area as the United States, but they only have 7% that's arable. And yet they feed 22% of the world's population on that.
So we're familiar with the industrialization of China, certainly in our modern times. That began in the late 1970s as they opened the doors to commercial work with the rest of the world. And at that time, they had one focus, and that was to build their economy and increase their GDP. There was a huge expansion of industry during that time, and a lot of that was driven, interestingly, by allowances for people to move within China. Prior to that, there were basically people had to stay where they grew up, and by allowing people to move around, this allowed for the industrialization of the country. And this economic growth that was associated with it had both good and bad aspects to it. It certainly improved the road systems, the communication, and the electrical grid. This was a major aspect of what they were doing. And just to give you a sense of that, they poured more concrete in a 3-year time period than the United States poured in the whole 20th century. They also built more roads in 1 year than the United States interstate highway system includes in totality. So huge, huge construction and industrial development. And that process ended up bringing 800 million people out of poverty. The affluence created by all of this new money and opportunity also expanded their university system, and then included many opportunities for people to travel and study abroad. But one of the things they realized once they let the cat out of the bag was that they had considerable unmanaged growth. And part of what is seen with that, of course, are buildings that were constructed without any residence planned. There were power stations that were built where there was either bad location or no growth. So there were many aspects of the growth that I think caught the Communist Party by surprise. It also, at that time, resulted in the creation of these mega cities. There are huge cities, over 20 million people in numerous places in China. And these are mostly as a result of this rapid economic growth. And as a result of the opening up and allowing people to move from the countryside to the city, the social fabric, particularly in villages, was significantly disrupted, and also created some terrible economic disparity between those who are educated and not educated, and those who live in the city versus the countryside. And of course, the thing that we are also aware of is that this economic growth resulted in huge ecological and public health problems. As you can see, this Beijing picture with the pollution here. So oddly enough, it was this that created a significant threat to the Communist Party. The process of economic development was based on pollute first and clean up later. But in 2011 and through 2013, the air apocalypse, as you can see in this picture here, resulted in the death of 1.6 million people from respiratory disease. In addition to that, the growth spurred of severe pollution of China's rivers, and the industrialization of the food supply contaminated or made much of the food not desirable for the people in China. At the same time, their science folks were looking out and saying, you know, sea level rise is coming up into many of the areas where we have lots of people, and flooding also threatens much of their land, including some of their best farmland. And now, of course, problems associated with the pandemic also have raised questions about just how the country is managed.
So while we were on our trip, every night we would be just madly writing down observations of things that we had been exposed to during the day. This picture shows a trip to one of the villages outside of, was it Beijing? Lishui. And as I said, prior to our trip, we knew about as much as any American would about China. And we were constantly checking our knowledge against what we were observing, and the following observations came to mind. So first of all, this is President Xi, and he's embraced this new economic model that he calls the Two Mountain Road, which is an image that can be easily explained to the Chinese people as we can pursue a robust economy and do it by cleaning up our environment and being more ecological. Now, China's 1.4 billion people makes it hard for them to turn the ship very quickly. So some people might say, well, you know, is this just in words or is this really happening? But the shift is going on. They're looking at gross environmental product as a very strong measure of how their economy is doing. They're working to clean their soil. They have localized systems that we'll talk about later for cleaning their water and their rivers. They've made great strides in cleaning their air, although they still have difficulties because they are the world's manufacturer. They've had massive adoption of clean energy industries, and they're looking at doing more of that as a stimulus for the pandemic. Strategic investments in technology, including AI and smart grid, electrical grid, and green energy. They have a greater emphasis on healthy food and abundant food, because we're talking about people within a couple generations ago that were starving. So abundant food is really important, and we experienced delicious food while we were there. And finally, with 1.4 billion people, they can pretty much fund a healthy ecotourism market just on their own, by their own people. So this Two Mountain Road is really a shift in an economic model being pushed by this president. And green is gold, I think, is something that I think the United States could learn from, that being green can fuel a very robust economy.
So we were toured around in many fairly rural areas, particularly in the Lishui and Puer part of our trip. Lots of mountainous places, small towns primarily. And one of the things that struck us was that everywhere we went, somebody was growing something. Every spare piece of ground, somebody is growing food. Now, some of this is more industrialized agriculture, and some of it is just subsistence agriculture. But some perspectives on this, as you can see in this picture, we have homes which are largely focused in the village, and then the farmland itself is kept as farmland. So it's a different kind of landscape than what we see here, where houses are dotted all over the place. And part of this is because the government owns and controls all the land in China. Individuals who want to farm can secure an allotment if there's land available. And there's an emphasis now of trying to keep farmers on the land and keep them productive because of this severe need to keep food production going. Over the years, there have been massive land use changes for a long time before they recognized the limits of their food production system. They basically allowed farmland to be consumed as we have in growing communities. But now there's a huge emphasis and a law that results in both the preservation of farmland as well as forest lands in China. And the one thing about farming that we saw there is that there's still a struggle between industrial and traditional forms of farming. And I'll talk about that here in just a moment. We also were able to visit several eco-villages, and these are basically what John Cobb has talked about in terms of communities and communities. These are places where people, generally small groups, are living together, learning how to live more in concert with nature and to explore things that they might not otherwise be able to explore as part of their mainstream Chinese upbringings. And so we're not absolutely sure how much the government supports these eco-villages, but we know that for the most part, they're able to move forward and experiment with things without government interference. Allison mentioned that there has been an attempt to restore faith in the food that's produced in China. We've had guests in our house that said they bought food from Japan because they wouldn't trust the food that was produced in China. So this tour allowed us to see a number of places where food production is being carried out in a way that it produces it in a healthy products. And we were able to visit mushroom farms, tea farms. These are lotus flowers on the bottom, rice. We looked at all sorts of different farming opportunities. This community on the center lower screen there is actually practicing a process where the farming of the soils is done in the upland area, and then all the water that comes from that land flows through this bed of lotus flowers where they grow a high quality and expensive product, and even grow crayfish in the water underneath. And then that clears the water before it goes on downstream. So overall, the government in doing this is also trying to recognize the importance of farmers and acknowledge that they're key to the success of the future. Much of the farming, as you can see with this gentleman here, is still done by hand on non-industrialized sites. We also were shown how public-private partnerships are being pursued, and here's a couple of examples we visited. One is this organic crop farm cooperative where the government went together with the business. They set up a very sophisticated management of the food products that are coming in, so that the farmer basically only has to grow the food. The cooperative provides the transportation to the wash and packing facility, and then manages the marketing of those products. As another aspect of it, they also teach the farmers how to produce organic products, and this cooperative only takes organic, so they're gradually building more and more connections that way. Similarly, we visited the International Coffee Exchange, which is growing some of presumably the best coffee in the world. They joked with us to say that they sell only their secondary products to Starbucks, but they keep all of their really good coffee for the increasing sophisticated taste of the Chinese people. Both of these are government and public-private partnerships. So their objective is to stimulate production, improve quality, and ultimately increase the incomes of the farmers. We also got to observe, as Dean pointed out earlier, electrification, which is happening all over China. The picture on the right shows what big government can do when they don't want noisy, stinky motorcycles anymore. They basically ban them. And then everything that we saw in the way of a scooter or a delivery van, as shown in the upper left there, are electric vehicles. We saw electric share cars, as Allison is pointing to there in the picture, and electric buses. So one of, I think, the most striking aspects of this and benefits that we saw while we were there is that it creates a much quieter city in addition to cleaning up the air. Allison would want me to say that at one point on a Saturday night, we sat on the busiest corner of Li Shui, which was about 4 lanes in each direction. And the noisiest thing that we heard on that street while cars and everything were going by were the people talking on the sidewalk that went by us. So there are huge benefits to electrification, and I think that it goes well beyond the clean air and the changes in power supply. And of course, China is one of the leaders in renewable energy. They have been, in addition to decommissioning a lot of their power plants that were inefficient or dirty, they have been basically building the world's solar cells and windmills. They have more jobs in energy and more total installed capacity, as well as commitments to additional capacity than anybody in the world. Their efforts to produce in mass quantity these products has driven down the prices so that we enjoy access to those that we wouldn't otherwise. And as a result of that, China, in their efforts to reduce their pollution, which they are the top carbon dioxide producer in the world, held the world's CO2 emissions at neutral for 3 years in a row. Now, China also gets a lot of electricity from hydroelectric dams. You can see there's 87,000 of those. I'm not sure that that's all a good thing, but it is an alternative to coal. There have been a lot of disruptions of ecosystems and human populations as a result of that.
So one of the things that we saw in every city that we went to was an emphasis on recycling. We didn't know that this was a rather new initiative that was really playing out in people's personal lives starting in 2019 with their national waste initiative. So basically, China is the kind of place where they have these 5-year plans, 10-year plans, a lot of planning processes, and then that trickles down to the local government. So the aim of this national waste initiative was to recycle 35% of waste in 46 major cities. Now, these are major cities of 20 million or more, or 10 million or more. We saw this evidenced as in the right-hand picture. There is a little eco-village where the neighbors decided that their village was a mess. They even had a goat that ate some garbage and then it died. And this galvanized the mothers of the community to take on cleaning up their community, and they do. And this little truck goes around and plays music, something similar to ice cream trucks of old in the United States, and that's a signal for everyone to bring their garbage out. And they recycle everything. The 4 bins on the left-hand corner there, they're uniform throughout China. One system, 4 different colors, easy, well, pretty easy squeezy. In the middle picture is a composting system that they were promoting in one of the eco-villages that we went to. And then the 4th picture really just talks about the widespread distribution systems by folks that probably came from the villages who are recycling everything. You can see styrofoam, plastic, cardboard, bedding, everything goes somewhere. And widespread poverty included a class of people who recycled waste for money. And we still saw quite a bit of that happening in several of the places that we went to. Now, China's record on conservation and wildlife has been pretty abysmal. And as we know now, the wet markets that have been providing the booming industry in China for hundreds of years has come under very public and embarrassing scrutiny. And because of the fact that many animals are classified for their medicinal uses and their traditional uses, wildlife conservation has been very difficult. And of late now, China's had to examine the role of these wet markets. And right now we're seeing living history being made as they grapple with how to conserve wildlife and how to respond to the public shaming they're getting from the origins of the pandemic that look likely to have happened in a wet market. And conservation is relatively new in this country. The word in Chinese for wilderness translates to a place of disfavor, a bewildering profusion of unusable and untidy land. And China really doesn't have a John Muir or a Teddy Roosevelt or a Terry Tempest Williams to harken back to why nature would be something you'd want to preserve. So this is a really new thing. We'll talk a little bit about it later, but it's a very big thing. Oh yeah, here it is. Ecological conservation red lines. So by the end of 2020, the Chinese government has been taking a look at how they can limit human encroachment in areas. They build up, as we all know. These 50-story buildings house hundreds of thousands of people. And their plan is to protect 1/4 of the Chinese mainland. And they tackled not the small places, but the one with 150 million people, the Yangtze River Delta, as one of the places where they would put a red line in the sand, basically, to say, thou shalt not build here, you have no business here. And in typical Chinese fashion, they even had massive relocations of people and businesses out of these areas. And a key factor in this is the federal government has established the theoretical goal, and then the locals need to buy into it, and they are expected to enforce it. So basically, if China is to develop sustainably, they are now realizing that they need to require an ecological space that is unrestricted by economic activity. This is a huge move for the future. They also have a long way to go on water. There's massive water management, has always been a focus in China. They've had such huge flooding that killed tens of thousands of people. They've tried to adopt US standards to clean up their rivers. It's been very difficult to do. And so now they are trying local accountability measures. They have river chiefs and lake chiefs, and they're local leaders who are empowered to enforce cleaning up the country's polluted waterways, which, as David explained, there are a lot of them. They are allocating funding to these locals to be able to do that. And hopefully this will have some improvement, but it's going to take time. The one picture on the left of the bull sitting on the concrete was on one of the places that we visited in Beijing, just to prove that they're concerned about where water goes is well-founded. Floods in China, as I said, have really created a lot of problems, and so the emphasis has always been on how to control the rivers, and controlling nature, we know, can't always have the best results. Finally, I wanted to point out one other thing, and that is we talk about our two poles, but there really is a third pole, and that is the Himalayan plateau, which contains a huge amount of waters encased in ice, and that provides a lot of the water that China relies on, and it's melting, so it's one of the future challenges that China is going to have to face, in addition to pollution. Village life and tradition, as we know, villages were pretty much decimated when people went to the cities to make more money. And they left the grandparents at home, and often the children stayed home with the grandparents. And we saw this repeatedly in places all over China where grandparents were taking care of their children's children. So the government is now encouraging a return to villages. They're providing incentives for increasing density in those villages. David, I think, will have an explanation about the lower right picture. And one of the ways that they used to unite their country was to build roads. And once they build roads, then the light industry and the high-tech industry starts to move into the villages. So we visited the two villages on the left, which I think are kind of model villages and part of that ecotourism move that they have going on in China. But the village on the right, I'd like David to explain just a bit about that one.
So you can see we have some buildings there that are 4 to 5 stories high, and then you have some single-story houses. And oftentimes the government now is going in and saying to anybody who has a single-story building, you can, if you agree to work with the government under another one of these public-private partnerships, you can basically trade out your single-story house for a brand new nice apartment in a multi-story building, and you can be a partial owner of that building and get rent from the other parts of the building as part of your outcome. So for a lot of older people, this allows them to bring their family back and gives them partial income from the other houses, while at the same time increasing density in the villages.
I think one of David's interpreters was actually engaged in these processes. Mm-hmm. Another area where a lot of international scrutiny has come to play in China is its treatment of minority cultures. As I said, there are 56 different cultures in China, minority groups, 92% being Han, but the others are very influential in huge numbers. We went to a little village on the left where you see the children. It was so cute. They did beautiful dances for us. They served us an incredible dinner with all different kinds of local foods. This was in Yunnan province outside of Pu'er. And we always encountered really curious people and big smiles from folks who had never seen Americans. So this lady, I think, is is genuinely curious and interested in us as we pass by. And the picture on the right is of the National Party Congress, where you'll see some of the ethnic minorities are there in their national costumes and traditional clothing. And the Chinese Constitution does provide equal voice through a special agreement with this minority Congress. Ultimately, I'm not going to go into it very much, but the goal is to preserve social harmony. Of course, the treatment of the Uyghurs out in the western part of the country leaves much to be desired, and there's been a lot of scrutiny about how they're treating their minorities there. But ultimately, the Constitution does guarantee equal rights for their minorities, and this is some place where we should watch for how that plays out in the future. As an educator, I was very interested in the schools that we were able to visit. We went to a kindergarten outside of Beijing. The Whitehead Kindergarten is really emphasizing art, outside time, naps, and play. Kindergarten is ages 3 through 6. It was all day from 7:30 to 5:30, and they were provided all their meals and all the programming by an incredible group of teachers who are trying to embrace a little bit less rigid teaching style, one that promotes the whole child and not just their academic performance. I also learned that Waldorf and Montessori education is rapidly gaining ground in China. Again, a more playful, creative, and laid-back approach is something that a lot of parents are seeking because they see that rote learning isn't going to teach their kids all the things that they need to know in life. One of our favorite visits was to the school, a university actually, where students were studying American culture and English. And on the right, you'll see there were a group of 50 kids there, and we made a little presentation, and they had a couple presentations, and then we had a question and answer period. And it was a great opportunity to just see how open and curious they were. I think we were maybe some of the first Americans they'd ever encountered, and we had a lively discussion. I know in the interest of time, I could go on forever talking about the educational influences, but this is really huge. There's still the struggle between achievement and kind of using your skill sets to make for a happy life. And I think that parents and kids are struggling with this in China. We'll see what happens down the road.
The last of our impressions was just around how the government actually works. And one of the things that we've learned is that civil service is a pathway. Once you get in it, that is your pathway for life. Leaders in China are identified and appointed to different jobs. So if a person decides they want to go into government, they're ultimately trained at a facility, many of them at a facility anyway, in Beijing, where we stayed when we first arrived there. And so it's a noble profession to be in government. It's also a system of meritocracy, which is quite interesting. And the way that works is basically a person's in a job, the community has goals, some of which are set locally, some are set more broadly. In the case of two of the communities we went to, because they're pilot communities and demonstration sites, they have goals that are higher than many other places in the country. And then the leaders are basically accountable for meeting those goals through their activities, their management that goes on. So when we met with several people who were like our county executive, they were very enthusiastic about what their job entailed and how they had, the main thing was that they were to make life better for people and that they had these goals. If they met these goals, then they were able to move up in the system and take on more responsibility. If they didn't, then they either stayed right where they were or they were actually replaced. So there's a very interesting kind of point system around local leaders and and how they actually help get things done.
I thought I might add on that. In one of the villages, we were talking with a woman, and we were explaining all of the dilemmas of who we were going to vote for in our elections and the whole democratic process. And she just looked at me and she said, "I've never been asked my opinion on politics or ever been asked to vote." And that kind of shut me up for a while. I was like, okay, even though they don't have a democratic system where voting is built into the system, this point system is actually quite effective in advancing people who have skill sets that give them the ability to lead well.
So Allison and I have been asked to return to China and to continue to work on issues related to community engagement and education. And as we think about that invitation and what we've observed and read in the meantime, we think about how we might do that in the future, we kind of go, well, you know, China's a bit of an enigma. We obviously don't hear about all the things that are going on over there, some of which, as we pointed out, are things that are not in our mainstream media. But really, it's a big, complicated place, and what they do is hugely important to the rest of the world. So we're kind of feeling like if we could help there, that might make a difference. We all need to understand the shift and the change that China is making right now. There's a lot of old history that's being brought forward and into a more modern context. And obviously, one of the things they're doing is expanding their influence around the world, particularly in places where we are deciding our relationships are not worth maintaining. And so as we are basically reversing course on things like environmental protection and energy, they're doubling down on all those things that will make them both successful and sustainable in the future, including renewable energy conservation and technology.
And no presentation about China would be complete without talking about Hong Kong and the initiatives that are happening in China right now, where they're flexing their political and social power. It was apparent to us from the very beginning that we were being surveilled most of the time, all of the time. There were cameras everywhere, even on the freeway. There was a camera there were cameras at a festival we went to, and there were cameras at the airport where they were able to find us and get us on our plane faster because they used facial recognition to find us. This centralized governance and control is really different from what we have in the United States. It was very apparent that people trust their government to do these things, but where they don't trust their government right now to do the right thing is in Hong Kong. There's a lot of propaganda happening in their media about what's going on in Hong Kong. The message was being conveyed most of the time that the protesters were hurting the police in Hong Kong. And when we got to Hong Kong and spent a couple days there with one of our prior international students that lived with us for 2 years, we got a little different story about what was going on there and how they really are trying to get what they feel was they were told they would get as being able to govern themselves and have the freedoms that they've become accustomed to. The US trade war, we were even asked about that by local media. And that was an interesting experience to respond to that. The Belt and Road Initiative is basically a global strategy that's been in place since 2013 to build infrastructure that basically is connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. It's part of a Made in China initiative, and it's huge. So you should probably learn a little bit about that if you haven't heard about it. I know that economic disparities still exist in China. We saw this in some of the villages where people were pretty poor, but people in the cities are really striving to achieve and gain ever more affluence. And finally, I think another thing that we should be watching is the payment due on the pandemic. I think there's going to be a lot of fallout, and already China, in its National Party Congress that's going on right now, has been formulating their company line, let's call it, about what happened. So stay tuned on that.
Well, and we're going to wrap up now, and with just a few thoughts of what the U.S. actually could learn from China. And I think one of the things that really struck us was they really value a long-term plan and vision. They know where they're going, and they can set in motion a lot of different things to make that happen. They're also using a variety of demonstration projects and pilot communities. One of the things that we really enjoyed was that the people talked about, not about the government or somebody else, they talked about we are doing things together, or we believe in this, and that really seemed to be very striking to us. There's a collective thinking on different topics that certainly helps them manage change faster. They are certainly listening to their scientists and taking them seriously. They're making huge efforts to address climate change and need to. And when they tackle things, big projects, they do it in a very strategic and rapid fashion. So they really believe that no matter how complicated it is, they can figure out how to get through it. So I think these are conceptual ideas and other activities that they have going on that really allow them to make the kind of changes that societies around the world need to be looking at right now. So, oh, and lastly, a point here, H.R. McMaster recently had an article in the Atlantic, and he said that from our standpoint, working with China, we need to practice strategic empathy, which is to look at China not through our eyes, but to look at China through the way they view the world.
So if there were anything that I would say about our trip is that we can't afford to ignore what's going on in China. And because of what David said about their can-do attitude, they think big. And really, the wall is an example. If China can build this wall, then they can do and will do anything. And they have a plan. And they're enacting a plan for economic dominance and leadership. And if we don't pay attention to that or try to be myopic in our view of China or demonize China, we lose opportunities to see how this future is going to play out. And they're looking for a chance to regain preeminence. And in McMaster's article, he talks about this, and that with 5,000 years of history, most of the time China was the preeminent power in its region. And they perceived the 20th century as an aberration, as an exception to this preeminence. And they also see it as a period of humiliation. And so that's motivating them to take on really challenging things and to claim what they think is theirs. So what China does or does not do, we have to realize, and to our benefit, we'll see that it has a singular impact on the entire world.
That's the last of our slides. I'm going to turn it back over now to Dean for some questions, if you have submitted them.
Thanks, David and Allison. Here's one question. We had a couple of questions along this line. Given that you were completely accompanied by minders, how do you discount the presence of those minders in the conversations you had with people and the sites that you were shown, the selection of sites you were shown?
Go ahead.
Well, they certainly looked after us. Let's just say that. We were always on the bus on time. We were at meals on time. And certainly they were, could have been monitoring what was going on. Most of them were university staff that were with us. And from our standpoint, they provided incredible insights into their lives in China and the politics and the things that were going on without big restrictions in what they said. But just the same, at least in Liandu, the second place that we went, as well as in Beijing, we were able to go and walk around anywhere we wanted without anybody following us. So that we could tell anyway. Of course, there are cameras everywhere. So as one man said, you know, we live in the safest society in the world. If anybody ever tried to rob you or anything, they would be caught within an hour because the cameras would have picked them up. But I think overall, we felt like they were mainly trying to make sure that we had the best understanding of the places that we were visiting.
Okay. You mentioned early in your presentation about the gross environmental product. How is that measured?
They are, I think, in the process of still really figuring that out, but I would say that one of the things we saw at one of the conferences was they've established targets for air quality, for water quality, for tree retention in watersheds, for public health standards. I believe that they're still kind of trying to figure out what it all means. And that's part of this interaction with outside countries, is to help them develop that kind of thing. But essentially, we saw presentations where they said, you know, here's our goal for water quality, and here's where we are today, and here's what we're trying to do to get to that point. So I think that what they feel like is that if they have a healthy and a productive society, that is not connected with the gross domestic product. And we've seen that in our country here, where we have millions of people out of work, but the stock market is going up. There's a disconnect between those two. So I've read some papers and things on it, and I think that this is something they're refining over time as a measure. And people bragged about, we live in the most beautiful part of China where the air is clear, the water's clean, and average population lives 5 years longer than anyone else in China.
I guess I would just add to that, whatever you measure matters, and they measure everything. They may not share it always publicly, but their local officials are aware of it, and they know that their career advancement depends on how well they do.
Allison, you touched on the question of Hong Kong. Can you share a little bit more about what your mainland hosts or any people in the mainland had to say to you about both the situation in Hong Kong and the treatment of Uyghurs, if any?
Yeah, so on one of our longer bus rides, I had a really substantive conversation with Mei Jun about the Uyghurs. And so what I realized from that conversation is it's complicated. So first of all of the ethnic minorities in China were not required to follow the one-child policy. And that creates, I think, there's a feeling, and what Mei Jun told us was that this was very difficult national sacrifice, but the minorities didn't have to comply. So that was an interesting perspective. The other is we didn't see any churches or houses of religious worship anywhere we went in China. So I think in the West, the Uyghurs are many of them of the Muslim faith, and I think this, and I don't know enough about it to say, but I think there's this conflict and feeling of threat from potential disagreement that could be rooted in the Muslim religion and the lack of religion in many parts of China. The treatment of the Uyghurs, in my conversation with Mei Jun, has been one to try to bring national unity. So I think that's what the people are being told, is it's about harmonious society. Now, in the south, near Pu'er, which is bordering on Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, there are up to 50 different ethnic minorities represented there, and we saw a lot of evidence of integration in that they're 50% of the population. So there seemed to be quite a bit more equitable treatment evidenced there, but that was just, of course, from our very small interactions in that part of the world.
I think as well, Mao Zedong made some agreements with those communities when he was in power that allowed them to maintain their cultural history and activities, and to give sort of a special status to those areas, mainly because there's such diversity along that border area down in there. And I think it quelled some of the concerns about the control of the Chinese people.
However, what we saw on the news regarding what's happening in Hong Kong was fairly one-sided, and a completely different story when we went to Hong Kong and saw what was happening and actually got caught in a huge traffic jam where we were basically on the street next door to a massive protest that basically had shut down that part of the city. And there were police everywhere, and there were protesters in their black t-shirts and their masks with their umbrellas that were really out there protesting, and had been for, at that time, consistently 17 or 18 weeks. And their perspectives, I think, were good for us to hear and see, because they certainly have an issue with becoming a part of China. They want to remain independent in many ways.
While we're on the subject of diversity, we had a question here about what's the state of the LGBTQ community in China? Are there provisions against discrimination there? Is gay marriage legal in China?
I'm not sure we can answer that. I would say one of the things that we noticed in China, which might have tipped us off, is that there's very little outward expression of emotion between people. Obviously, people having fun and that kind of thing is one thing, but it was quite striking for us to go to Hong Kong, where couples were walking around holding hands and hugging and so forth, and in China, where we saw nothing like that. So I can't answer that question specifically for that community of people. I do know that one time I kissed Allison, and you know, everywhere we went there were cameras everywhere, you know, and people following us, because this was a big deal to them. We were in the media, interviewed by people and stuff, but one day I kissed Allison, and it just about sent everybody through the roof. They didn't know what to think about that.
No public
Your affection is forever recorded. Your affection is forever recorded.
Yeah.
Another quick question. You talked about these eco-villages. How big are these villages? Are they the size of Bellingham, Ferndale, Nooksack?
Oh, they're very small.
They're very small. They're probably, you know, they're villages within villages oftentimes. And one we visited outside of Beijing, if you could say it was a true eco-village, they consider themselves to be, but there's about 2,500 people. And they're mainly focused right now, as you saw in the recycling picture, on just recycling garbage, and they're starting to do some things with special agricultural practices. But from that recycling effort, then they're learning a lot about reuse of products and reducing waste. They have their own little grocery store for organic and other safe products. They built their own little daycare center.
They had a Waldorf school too.
Had a Waldorf school.
Which I think is something that's actually serves as a magnet. So because of their Waldorf school, which I think had 300 students,
yeah,
they are pulling from people who live in Beijing, but they're living closer to this village so that their kids can go to that school. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like an economic driver of a sort to have a Waldorf school or a Montessori school in your community.
And some are sponsored by universities as well. So they're basically, they've got a professor who's sort of like the counselor lead person there, and then students are moving there and living in a fashion like our son, who lived in a sustainable village in Costa Rica. Very similar kinds of shared outcomes and living sustainly as the primary focus. So I think it's at that scale, it's still pretty small throughout China. What we were equally exposed to were the communities that, like Liandu, which was 300,000 people, something like that, where they're setting bigger community goals for basically quality of life. And as a contrast to sort of the standard concrete and gray classic Chinese kind of backdrop.
Yeah, I think time for one final question here. As you noted, China is very much a secular society, and you commented on, the lack of worship places that you saw. It's a secular society, but it has very ancient traditions of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and all those traditions value a harmonious relationship with nature. Can you comment on to what extent Chinese society is resonating with these traditions now?
I think that that's a big change. When we look at China and just like flying over it, you see where there are villages everywhere, right? The landscape is occupied to a huge extent, and that has resulted in the use of the land for thousands of years. And so even this idea of conserving land because of flooding or because of ecosystem requirements or air quality, I think that's kind of foreign. So what we saw was a lot of, if people lived in the city, we saw a lot of parks, but they were usually pretty small for the most part. And I didn't get a sense that people like drive out to go and spend the afternoon out in the wild. That just wasn't a kind of part of the overall way of living for people. Certainly city parks are big gathering places and that kind of thing, but I find it interesting that so much of the art kind of looks at beautiful mountainsides and mists and trees and fish and all these things, and yet as the population has grown over all these years, I think that they've decimated a lot of those things that are at the cultural foundation. And that's why this concept of ecological civilization has those underpinnings in it, trying to pull back to those foundations of Chinese society to see if people can appreciate those things in another way. And it's tied to their training in their schools and stuff, where basically, the kids from the time that they're kindergarten on up to through college, they're expected to have no fun. They're supposed to just study. And part of Meizheng's whole approach to this is to show that the school systems need to change to teach an appreciation for nature, because without nature and without a healthy ecosystem, the Chinese will not survive, and neither will any of the rest of us.
Right.
So they are so critical, and that tie back is just really going to be an important connection between those old traditions and this new concept.
Yeah.
Well, our time has flown by.
It has.
I hope everyone has enjoyed this program. I know I've certainly learned a lot. And I think the technology has cooperated with us rather nicely today. Do know that the chat will still be open for a few more minutes if you have comments on the program. And also, as I said at the beginning, you'll be getting an email with an invitation to comment on the program and its format. So with that, thanks everyone for joining us for this first virtual City Club meeting. And I hope you have a very pleasant afternoon.